welcome to Series 3 of Autism in Conversation with Auticon, a podcast from Auticon, a global IT consultancy whose consultants are all autistic. This series is designed to help raise greater understanding and appreciation of autism through fascinating conversations with inspirational guests. Hosted by me, Carrie Grant, each episode will feature fantastic guests from all walks of life who share a passion for making the world more inclusive. We'll be talking about the many benefits of hiring neurodivergent talent through to some of the more common challenges faced by autistic adults navigating the workplace, plus much, much more. All of my 4 children are neurodivergent, yay! So this is a subject very close to my heart. I'm really looking forward to facilitating some great conversations about autism and hopefully learning some new things along the way. I hope you enjoy it too. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Autism in Conversation with Auticon. Today's episode is one very close to my heart. It's all about the transition from education to the workplace for autistic people. I run a support group for a couple of hundred families of autistic girls, non-binary and trans kids, and for those parents, we all talk about school constantly, the challenges at school, the challenges to get the assessments, the challenges to get the support, therapy, etc. But one of the things that kind of goes unsaid until they all get just a little bit older is what happens once our children leave school. And it's sometimes at that point that the biggest challenges come along. We all imagine that, once they're out of school and they're in the working world, it's all going to get a lot easier. And for some people, it does get easier. That's the case certainly for my 20-year-old child, Tylen, who says, they always told me at school it wouldn't get any better than when you're at school. These are the best days of your life. And Tylen says, hella no. These were the worst days of my life, and working life is way easier than it was at school. So we're going to have varying opinions, I'm sure, on some of this, but it is a subject we don't talk about nearly enough. I'm joined today by a fantastic panel of guests. Mark Blakey, who's the CEO of Autism Parenting magazine. Andrew Crosbie, a volunteer co-chairperson of the South Lanarkshire branch of the National Autistic Society. Wendy Flewitt, who is the Transition Support Service Coordinator for England at the National Autistic Society, and also Anna Kennedy, OBE, great friend. OK, welcome to the show, everybody. So first up, a question for you, Wendy. I'd like to come to you first because do you know roughly how many autistic people receive a diagnosis during childhood as compared to those who have been diagnosed in adulthood? Because the figures are rising for adults. Well, they're rising altogether, aren't they? But what are the figures for those two groups?
Well, there's no conclusive data that we're aware of that compares the amount of people who receive a diagnosis in childhood compared to in adulthood. But our clinical director at the Lawn and Wing Centre, Sarah Listerbrook, has said anecdotally that most people receive a diagnosis in childhood.
And is that the same for girls, Wendy? Because we do hear
Possibly
about
not.
women. Yeah, we do hear about women in their sort of late 30s, early 40s suddenly getting diagnoses.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for girls, it tends to be later on. They tend to be diagnosed more in sort of teenage years and in adulthood. But it's very hard to sort of get clear figures on that.
Anna, do you have any more insights there? Could you explain the differences when it comes to male and female diagnosis?
So with reference to diagnosis, because I have 2 sons that are autistic, Patrick's 33 now and Angelo's 30, and obviously I went through the diagnosis process quite a few years ago. To be fair, nothing much has changed really, in my opinion, with reference to wait times, because people are still waiting. And I would say probably now it's slightly worse because of everything that's going on within the system, the cost cutting. I speak to parents all the time and adults that have been waiting 2, 3, 5 years for a diagnosis. So that's very frustrating for children, for adults and for families, because obviously the schools are not knowing, what support they need to put in place because the diagnosis process hasn't gone through. And obviously, I find that really, really frustrating. And with my youngest son, Patrick, he was diagnosed at 4, but we didn't find out till he was 7. We found out by accident. They actually kept it from us. So he struggled for 3 years going into school. And I thought it was because he was premature and he had a lot of difficulties, with being born sort of 11 weeks premature, only £2. So I thought those were the difficulties that he was having. And with reference to Angelo, he was diagnosed quite early. He got diagnosed when he was about 2. But I speak into parents and adults all the time that are very frustrated trying to get a diagnosis, whether they're male, whether they're female. And some of them now, what they're doing is, and they did this at the time as well when my kids were younger, was maxing out credit cards, trying to get a private diagnosis, which can be very, very costly. You're looking at £3,000-4,000. And sometimes what you find as well is that when families then say, look, I've got a private diagnosis, they go to their local authority. Some of them are not accepting the private diagnosis. They feel that they need to go through the proper system, which is really frustrating. And I was only just speaking about this yesterday to the Cordwell Children Foundation, and they've got this process now where they're trying to help parents with diagnosis, so they are able to turn it around within 6 weeks. But a lot of people don't know about this process, but it depends on very much means tested. So if you're really struggling, they can help you. But if you want to pay for a diagnosis, I think they said it was something like £4,000-5,000, but then you get support for the whole year, for that year, to help you. So, and they seem to think that their diagnosis will be accepted. It has the NHS tick mark, if you like. So I only found out about that yesterday. So I thought that might be a little bit of useful information for parents that are really struggling, that they might find. So check it out. It's the Caldwell Children Foundation, and they actually have a proper diagnosis centre with speech and language, occupational therapy, so you can go through the whole process. So yes, with reference to male and female, well, male and female autism, the way I look at it is male and female, they're different anyway. So it's going to present itself in a different way, isn't it? But I would say the difference for me is watching that programme with Christine McGuinness just now about female, talking about masking. I've spoken to so many young women that have been diagnosed, talking about how they had to mask at school. They want to socialise, they want to mix with everyone, but they just find it so difficult and they're so vulnerable. Again, I spoke to a young lady that's gone through a toxic relationship. She's autistic, but because she wants things to remain the same, she's finding it difficult to pull herself away, and it's affecting her mental health, it's affecting her well-being. So she's finally, I'm glad to say, found the courage to move away from this relationship. But there's a lot of support that's needed in that specific area as well, because like my own son, he wants to fit in with society. He wants to contribute to society just like everybody else. And why shouldn't they? But it's just that they just need that little bit of extra support.
Andrew, when were you first diagnosed as autistic?
So I was first diagnosed in 2000 when I was a toddler at the age of 4.
So you're very young, weren't you? And when you had your diagnosis, obviously you were at school. Were adjustments made for you at school? Did you get the help that you needed?
We eventually got it in with a classroom assistant in primary, but particularly within the secondary, because I had made a placing request to go to a different school in the area which had a support base attached to it. Then there was a lot of adjustments made.
And it's often in those transition moments where things drop off. That's quite interesting that you're saying that Andrew, because secondary school can be a time, I know, for parents where they suddenly start tearing their hair out about the lack of help that their children are receiving. And for you, Mark, based on what you hear as part of your role as CEO at Autism Parenting magazine, what are some of the most common issues that young autistic people and their parents are concerned about?
So firstly, I think it depends very much on the severity of autism, how it manifests. So for somebody that's higher functioning, a young person, obviously they have certain ideas about the workplace that they want to incorporate. And I'd say for parents generally, parents of autistic kids, very often the conversation in their head, the biggest question is, what's going to happen to my child after I die? So in that way, on one hand, they want their child to live independently and learn the skills, but in the transition, obviously it can create a lot of anxiety for them about how their child will be accepted, understood, whereas maybe in an education setting, people will be understood as being a little bit different. And in the workplace, obviously that's not the case, particularly if somebody's not diagnosed or hasn't fully become aware of how autism manifests in themselves.
Absolutely. Wendy, what do you think are the most commonly occurring issues when it comes to transitioning away from the educational environment and into the workplace?
In terms of sort of employment-based, which we get quite a lot of questions about, obviously. So it tends to be people looking for work or training or volunteer opportunities, sort of in the transition from education. And there's a lot of concern around disclosing their diagnosis to prospective employers due to the negative connotations. So that's quite a big one that we give advice about.
What do you say to those people? I'd be interested to know. Disclosure.
We have an employment team who have done a lot of work in this area, and they give very clear advice around how to disclose, when to disclose. So we tend to point people in that direction, really, for that sort of expert advice. But yeah, and a lot of anxiety around the interview process because people don't always realise that their reasonable adjustments can be put into place for the interview process, or they don't want to ask for them because it makes them feel exposed, or that they're going to be placed at a disadvantage by sort of highlighting that.
Andrew, what do you think are the most commonly occurring issues when it comes to going from education and into work? What are the things that you hear about?
I felt, for me, I would agree with everything that Wendy said, but I felt for me that I didn't know what I was actually entitled to in terms of adjustments. So although the firms were asking, I thought, I don't have anything wrong with my mobility, so there's nothing I can ask for. However, after I entered the workplace, I then received some support from the National Autistic Society's Moving Forward team up in Glasgow, who then passed on some information about what I was entitled to, so I now request that.
And what about disclosure? Andrew, do you tell people that you're autistic when you go to work? Yeah, you're straight up about it.
Yes, I disclose that I have a disability.
Yeah, and do people struggle with that? Like when you talk to other autistic people, I'm under the impression that a fair few autistic people find that quite a difficult thing to do.
So most of the people that I work with within the branch are sort of primary school age group. So we've obviously not came across that situation, but from events and that in the community in general, it's kind of a 50-50 split.
What about for you, Mark? What do you see as the most commonly occurring issues when it comes to going from education into the workplace? I'm imagining, because obviously it's parenting, the parenting magazine, but what are the issues that the young people face, and what are the concerns that the parents have?
Firstly, the education space is a lot safer than the workplace. It's a lot more held. It's designed to be that way. It's also designed around education. Now, what we see is when people enter the workforce, often that transition from being in learning mode to kind of being productive or contributing somehow to a company or an organisation, that can kind of be a little bit the challenge. And also, I mean, one thing I'd like to note is that we're entering a time where the generation that's entering the workforce is very different to the older generation, and kind of comes with its own set of challenges. Like, for example, millennials and Gen Z, they think very different to Gen X and baby boomers, and they have a totally different idea about how the workforce or the workplace should be to prior generations. So as well as kind of being autistic, there's kind of another layer on top where I think young people generally are a little bit misunderstood in the workforce. They have different values, and kind of that transition from this kind of safe education space into the workforce, it can be a little bit daunting. And I agree with everything that was said about disclosure, because it's a very difficult thing. On one hand, there's potentially a lot of discrimination if people disclose, but then equally, if they don't disclose, there's kind of, it can become obvious at some point that people think differently or behave differently or have different sets of needs, essentially.
And for you, Anna, you obviously you talk about your sons, and you do so much work in this area of transition from those educational settings into the workplace. What are the challenges?
First of all, from school to college, as in a transition, this was highlighted in a documentary that I did with Katie Price with Harvey and me. And because Harvey's got so many health issues and challenges, she didn't realize that you have to actually apply a couple of years before they go into the college, so that they get the right college for them and it's going to be the right fit. So when we did this documentary, a lot of parents then started messaging me within the charity thinking, oh, I didn't know that you had to apply so early for a college, which the right type of college for my son or the right type of college for my daughter. So then we did workshops, and then we touched upon trying to find the right work placement or work experience. And for me, I think what a good option is with reference to finding, and it also helped my own son, was apprenticeships. I think they're a great way forward to go from college to the workplace, because then they're taught the work, whatever they choose to chat. For my son, it was like working in a garage, because at that time he was actually in his bedroom. And once I've spoken to so many families where their kids are in their bedrooms, they don't want to come out, they stop socializing. And what I did was then I started looking at employers, and I said, my son Patrick, this is who he is. Would you be interested in giving him some work experience? Would you be interested in giving him a position? And I've spoke to a lot of families and a lot of mums, a lot of dads that have actually done this, where they've identified an employer that potentially might take their son or their daughter, whatever their interest may be, because it is quite hard to find an employer that's going to make reasonable adjustments, because I think some of them just really don't understand what reasonable adjustments are for our children, for our adults. And I think sometimes it's just something so small. Like when my son started working at the garage, for example, they used to play Capital Radio all the time, and it used to drive him mad, and he couldn't concentrate on the work that he was doing. So he used to say, why are you playing Capital Radio all the time? They play the same music over and over again. Why are you listening to it? You've heard it the first time. Why do you need to listen to it again? So what they did for him was then they said, well, we like to listen to it, but for you, Patrick, what we do is like an hour in the day, we'll turn it off, so we don't have to listen to that particular radio. We'll put something on that you like. So little adjustments like that can really help. He used to get really hot, so what they did was they got him a fan. So they put the fan next to him when he was working. And then maybe at lunchtime he might have said, can I go for a walk? I'm just not right in the right headspace for working at the minute. So they used to let him go for a walk, and then he'd come back, chill out, and then he'd be able to, get on with his job. Again, when he went on to his next job, they gave him a specific area, because he worked in an open plan office. And if you've got sensory difficulties, that can be quite stressful. So he could hear everything that was going on. So they sort of placed him a little bit more to the back of the room. And then they would give him a room where he could go to. And because he's mad about dinosaurs and paleontology, they gave him an armchair right in the corner of this sort of chill out room, if you want to call it, or where people go for a cup of coffee. And he had posters up of dinosaurs, Jurassic Park, or whatever it was. So that was his space that he could go to for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, however long he needed. And sometimes he used to go to sleep because he said he needed to shut the world out. So those sort of adjustments made for my son, what do they cost? Hardly anything at all. So what you need to do is get to know the individual. Other things that help within the workplace as well for him is he needs to know what is it that he's supposed to be doing during the day to keep him on task. So they'd give him a list. So he'd tick it off, or he'd put it on his phone, or there's apps that you can get. So you just need to make small, reasonable adjustments. And I've spoken to other workplaces. My husband, Sean, he's autistic. He's a barrister. He's found a way of working. So for him, working in an office doesn't work for him. He works from home. So they've set up a virtual practice. You've got to think out of the box. So for me, with reference to the workplace, speak to the company. Don't bombard them with policies to read as well when they first start, because that can be quite overwhelming. For me, I would say is let them settle into the job a little bit, then start giving them the policies, and then they'll make more sense to them. So small little things like that can really help, in my opinion. And if you're a parent and your son or your daughter's finding it difficult to get a job, just contact businesses. I've done that in the past for my son. I've spoken to other parents where they've done that, and it's worked for them. I'll tell you one other thing as well, that I've spoken to quite a few adults, that when they fill out their application form, a lot of them are not putting that they're autistic. or they have a diagnosis or whatever the diagnosis is, because they're very worried about just being discriminated against. And to be fair, the second time my son applied for a job, he hated going to the job centre. Absolutely, just he didn't like it because of everything that was going on. He just said he couldn't wait to get out of there. But a couple of times he obviously applied for jobs, didn't even get an interview. So then when he did apply for some jobs without putting the diagnosis on, then he got an interview. But obviously it's down to the person. But when he actually got the job, he said on the first day, I always remember he told me, he said, Mum, I said to them, just wanted to let you know I've got autism. And if you don't like it, I'm really sorry. So then what the head of the department said, don't worry about it, Patrick. He said, this person's got dyspraxia, this person's got dyslexia. We are part of a team. And for me, that was fantastic. So, and he's been there for 4 years now. So, hey, it's working.
Do you think that things, let's direct this to Wendy, do you think that things are changing? And if they are changing, what are the things that are happening that are working for our young people?
I think, excuse me, I think it's become a bit more complicated after COVID. So we're in a very strange time at the moment. Resources are much tighter. So in some ways, I think things are becoming a bit more difficult in the current climate. Many young people, including those on the autistic spectrum, are really struggling to adapt following the lockdowns and online learning. And I get quite a few calls from parents whose children were functioning quite well prior to COVID, and a lot of them have dropped out of education, which then makes it very difficult to transition into work or training or back into education. So there's a lot of concern in that area.
And what can be done about that? I'm thinking about my child who spent 3 years out of school, you know, those first teen years out of school, went back in kind of GCSE year and is now expected to go to college and, you know, and then get a job. But it all feels like it's happening too quickly. Those 3 years were robbed out of their education and they're missing that big gap. I do wonder, how do we help our young people to be ready for the workplace?
Yeah, I think it's going to be quite a challenge. I think it's going to take a long time before we realise the full impact of that, particularly on people who have those sort of added difficulties and are really struggling to get back into being around other people and back into education. So I think it's going to be sort of a long, slow process, really, and there needs to be a lot of understanding around how those young people are going to adjust to all of that.
Yeah. Now, Mark mentioned about, you know, school being quite a holding place, which I'm guessing some people will agree with, and there'll be some people who will think, oh my gosh, school wasn't holding for me at all. It was really difficult. So is the workplace, Mark, would you say the workplace is better than school or not better than school? Is it harder than school, or is it an easier environment for our autistic people?
I think it very much depends on the individual and the level of severity of autism. So for somebody that's extremely intelligent but autistic, to enter the workforce can potentially be a really exciting opportunity to put their skills and their talents to work. You know, generally people with autism do very well in IT, but maybe for somebody that has a little bit more severe autism and they're used to being in special education and really having that holding, it would really depend on the role they're going into. And then there's probably this grey area in the middle for most people that you know, they don't necessarily like school and they get through it, but it's a very predictable environment. Like you spend a lot of years in the education system, which in a way autistic people like that predictability. So the change of actually getting a job and then, you know, maybe getting another job, that's quite scary. That's my perception of the situation.
Thank you, Mark. And Andrew, for you, is school the best days of your life, or is the working world better?
I would say I prefer the workplace because when I was in primary school, I'd experienced a lot of bullying for being on the spectrum. and I felt I had no support, whereas if anything happens in the workplace, I feel I've got the trade union and I've got HR that I can go to for help.
Yeah, it feels like there's more of a. That feels criminal to me. It feels, why is school not the safe law by law? Why isn't it not safe in school? That's not a good thing. Okay, and for you, Anna, you've obviously you started a school, so we know that your school hopefully, and of course, will be like fantastic because it's made absolutely for your people. But what about the workplace? Is it more challenging there?
I've been working with the school for 23 years, but I no longer am with the school. So I am focused on the charity that I do. I'm in so many different projects where it was actually one of the best things that I ever did. It was a big learning curve for me. But what I've seen is from children that are leaving school, whether it's mainstream, whether it's a special school, and going into the workplace, I've spoken to a lot of adults where it's less pressure, if you like. So you haven't got all those organisational skills that you need when you're at school. Because what I find is when I've spoken to parents, for example, when they're struggling at school, so they're in primary school, it's a little bit more structured. So they're always in the same class with the same cohort of children. But then they move on to secondary school. And that's when a lot of the time it can break down because they're moving from classroom to classroom. There's all those sensory issues that are going on, the build up to the exams, more homework. And this is when the stresses start kicking in. So you'll find that some families might do home tuition, or some families might say, oh, mainstream's not working for my child, they may need to go to a specialist. But it's not as easy as that because the system is so complicated. There's all of this waiting time as well. And then once parents as well are starting going through the system, it's like they're speaking a different language. I didn't know what SALT was when it first started. I didn't know what OT is. You've got to know this, like it's almost like it's a different language that they've created for children with special educational needs. And it's almost like, how can we make their life more harder? How can we make it more difficult? But with reference to our adults, from college to the workplace, I've spoken to quite a few adults where it is easier for them because it's less pressured. It depends on the workplace as well. Obviously they're putting the right reasonable adjustments in for our adults and they're accepting. But you'll find that once they've tapped into their strengths, their confidence starts growing and they can think, right, I can do this job, and then that's the same what's happened with my son Patrick. When he first started, he was very worried about, what people thinking about me, are they going to think I'm stupid and all the rest of it. But when they accepted him and he's been there for 4 years, you can see these chests puffed out more, like I am valued, you are valuing me. And that's what our adults want. So I would say that once they're in the workplace and it's the right workplace, and obviously there's a lot more awareness raising now, we're always talking about acceptance, but I still think we've got a long way to go, but we're getting there slowly. But definitely I would say when they're in the workplace, a lot of adults, not all, are thriving.
So let's have a look at the types of groups or companies that you might know of that you think are doing things really well. Have you guys got any examples of where you've seen really good practice? Wendy, let's come to you first with this. Is there anything that you've seen out there that you thought that really works well for these young people? We need to be rolling this out.
I mean, I don't have a lot of direct contact with companies, so that would be more our employment team. But sort of chatting with them, their experience is that the bigger companies are starting to come around to the idea of inclusion, partly because there's an expectation that they will do that, but they seem to be a lot more open. Sort of medium-sized and smaller companies are struggling in that area, really. They still seem a little bit reluctant to take it on because of the challenges involved and the fear of getting it wrong. So obviously we do a lot of campaigning as the National Autistic Society. We do a lot of campaigning around employment and highlighting the autism employment gap. So I guess we sort of come at it more from the campaigning side, really.
What campaigning does the NAS do on this front?
I think they've been campaigning for sort of many years, really. And one of the things that they have sort of achieved in sort of one of the more recent campaigns is to have the figures, specific figures about how many autistic people are in work. And I think that figure is currently around 22%. I think that's full-time work.
Yeah. That's chronically low.
Yes, it is. Yeah, quite scarily low. So they have, that has been published, and they're continuing to campaign for the government to close that employment gap.
What about best practice, things that you've seen, Wendy, that you think that just around you working with the NAS, what works for autistic people?
I think sort of transition sort of through education and beyond needs to sort of focus much more actively on preparing people for work. I think there is a bit of a gap between sort of the school environment as the work environment, as we've been talking about. And if people have a more positive experience in school, this can help to increase the sort of confidence and self-esteem, which enables them to sort of self-advocate really a bit more once they get into the work environment. And our employment team was saying that it needs to be a longer process, so that when someone is getting into work, it can take quite a while to set up access to work and those kind of things. So it just needs to be sort of a longer, more understanding process, I guess.
The patience.
Looking at.
Yeah. Mark, what have you seen any good practice you've thought, we need to be doing more of that? These people are getting it right. And if they're getting it right, what are they doing?
So one of our advertisers, actually, they built a company from the ground up with kind of neurodiversity in mind, and particularly they have an emphasis on recruiting autistic people, because they actually want to harness the talent that comes with that. And obviously, because most of the company is neurodiverse, it really makes everything easier in terms of communication and things flowing. I've also seen big initiatives from companies like PayPal, who are also understanding the talent pool that comes from autistic people, where previously they would have been discriminated against. And I see it a lot in tech. I think naturally a lot of people gravitate towards tech and kind of engineering, those kind of things. So it's often easier to enter those kind of companies, I find, because diagnosed or undiagnosed, it generally attracts people that are kind of higher on the spectrum.
I see. Thank you for that. And for you, Andrew, what is there anything that you've seen in the area that
I would just in general agree with what the other two colleagues have said, that I haven't, that I would say the same sort of examples as them.
Yeah, and for you, Anna, when you've looked out there and you meet and see a lot of different people, when you're chatting to people, what are they saying? This is really working. Wow, this company is great. I never knew they did this, and look at what they're up to.
Okay, so with reference to companies, I'd like to focus on one particular company that we've been working with for the last 3 or 4 years now. 2 companies, actually. So one of them was Great Western Railway. We did some training for them, and it went out to like 5,000 of their staff online and talked. We had an autistic adult, and I spoke, and my husband spoke as well. And with reference to raising awareness about autism and acceptance. And what came out of the training was that some colleagues that had been working together hadn't realised, for example, that they'd had sons or daughters that were autistic, or they'd had relatives that were autistic, because they were worried about sharing that information, because sometimes there still is a little bit stigma attached, or what they're going to think about, if I share that information. And you know what? They said that it was like a big weight had been lifted up from their shoulders. They were able to share experiences. And what they've also done is they've put more work experience in for people who are autistic. And obviously people have come out the woodwork that haven't said before that they were autistic. So for me, that's a positive. And another company that we're working with, and I know they're getting a bit of a knocking at the moment, is the Metropolitan Police. We've been working with them for 4 or 5 years. So we did awareness raising for them about must have been about 3 or 4 years ago, and we did it online, and Katie Price joined in with us as well, talking about Harvey and the difficulties that he had. And what has come out from that particular meeting is that they've got a support group that they meet on Teams once a month. So it's for families or officers that have got autistic children, or who are autistic themselves, so they can talk about the difficulties that they have within the police and what could be improved for them. So for me, that was a real positive, and we're working with them at the minute, and it's been distributed for the stop and search, because I've had a lot of adults, as has my husband, within the legal framework, that have been stop and searched by the police, and they don't really understand how to deal with that particular person. You know, my son was stopped, and it was, must have been about 6 or 7 years ago. And because of his sensory issues, as soon as he hears a siren or anything like that, it really scares him. So he started running. So the police stopped, and then they stopped him, and they sort of made him take out all of his pockets and everything. And then they said to him, "Oh, you seem okay," but he was just like very nervous and obviously very stressed. So they said, "What do you want us to do? Do you want us to ring the hospital?" So he went, "No, can you just ring my mum?" So they rang me, and I spoke to them, and I just said, "This is my son, Patrick." He said, "Is there anything we need to do for him? We just, he was just acting a little bit suspicious, but obviously everything's fine." I said, "No, just send him home. He'll be fine, and then I'll deal with it." So, and I'm not the only mom that has shared that story. Other parents have shared similar stories. So for me, this is a positive within the Metropolitan Police. So they've embraced our stop and search document. We've been working in collaboration with them. Autistic police officers have contributed it. It's gone across the Metropolitan Police and various other organisations, and some really, really positive feedback. And we are going to be doing some training with them as well in June. So that's a positive. So for me, there's not a lot of positive stuff to share at the moment about employees. It's getting better. They're learning. I think it's just that they're worried, and it's the unknown for a lot of companies. They're not quite sure what they're dealing with. So, because there is a lot of negative stories out there about autism. And for me, it's like some reporters don't write particularly well. And when I read things, I just think, oh, why have they written that? Why have they've identified that? And it's just like, let's share some positive stories. And that's what my charity is about. It's about positive role models. And I'll just share one more thing about the workplace, that one of my role models, Ben, is amazing. He went through the care system, he lived on the streets, and he turned it around, and now he's an entrepreneur, and he went on Dragon's Den and he won his bid, and he was amazing. I was so proud of him, and a lot of, how can I say, positive stuff has come from him being on Dragon's Den. So I'm really proud, because I know his whole backstory, and what he's achieved is amazing. So for me, it's about sharing positive role models, giving light at the end of the tunnel for families, because obviously they're very worried. And what's one last thing I'm going to say, you can edit it or whatever, but the question that parents have at the back of their minds is, who is going to look after my son or my daughter when I'm no longer around? And I have that question at the back of my mind, especially with my youngest son, Angelo, who's always going to need one-to-one support, minimal verbal skills. It's just like, if anything happened to him, he wouldn't be able to share with someone. Say, for example, he might be abused or whatever it is, wherever he is. Those are the worries that parents have all the time. And especially now with all the cost cutting that's going on within the government, there's less and less services, and a lot of local authorities don't actually know how many parents are looking after their adult children at home.
Okay, so for this last section, I'd like to hear what you'd like to see happen next, whether that be in terms of awareness raising, policy changes, or something completely different. What more can be done to help autistic people thrive both in education and in the working world? Wendy?
I think for me, the transition process starts around age 14 for our young people, and it needs to be much more focused on sort of how to sort of prepare people for work and the kinds of expectations there will be. So there needs to be sort of a lot more practical support, a lot more practical input. Work experience is almost impossible to come by for autistic young people.
It's nuts.
And so obviously, they get into a working environment and it's so alien, or it can be so alien, that, it just doesn't go well for them. So it needs to be much better planned from an early stage to sort of increase that confidence, to give them the practical experience of what a working environment might be like for them. And things like supported work programmes are really vital. So around sort of further education, there's a lot of employability programmes, particularly for people who are subject to statutory education plans.
Yeah.
So So there needs to just be a much higher level of support when people are in the process of moving from education into work. So you're going from a very high level of support in an education environment, if you're on an education plan, and then moving to a work environment where there's, a lot less support. So it needs to be much more structured, a lot more sort of support put in place on an ongoing basis, really, in order to sort of not just get people into work, but to keep people in work as well.
Yeah, and to get them into jobs that are worthy of their talent. Okay,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
for you, Andrew, what do you think would be, what would really help our autistic community to thrive, both in education, but more importantly in work in this
I
podcast?
think within education, I would say, first of all, I think there need to be more done to ensure sort of dignity and respect and about proper awareness of autism. As I said, I was fortunate to be at that school that had that support base, which had the experience, which meant that I got some adjustments in place, like going to use the support base for break and lunch, and also a quieter place to change for PE and to use the corridors 5 minutes before everyone else so that it wasn't as crowded. Within the workplace, I feel the main issue that needs to get addressed is the sort of preferential treatment culture there can be at times when asking for interview adjustments, because I feel, in my view, that based on my experience, that's very contributory to the employment gap, because they're experiencing a brick wall the minute they go and apply for the post.
Absolutely agree with you there, Andrew. And for you, Mark, you're working with parents, you're hearing their stories. What can be done for our autistic community, both in education, preparing for the workplace, but also in the working world?
Yeah, so we often refer to it as adulting. So it's that process of taking an adolescent into adulthood and kind of preparing them for independence. And on that hand, particularly for autistic people, there are a lot of kind of soft skills that need to be taught that aren't necessarily intuitive. Can also be simple things like personal hygiene, how to behave in the workplace, developing kind of softer social skills to make it a little bit easier without trying to change the individual too much. And I mean, I'd like to pick up on something Wendy was saying earlier about the challenge really for small and medium-sized businesses to embrace the challenge of working with autistic people, because I think awareness campaigns are great, but actually companies also need a little bit more guidance about how to work with autistic people, how to incorporate them into their environment. What are their needs? What are their challenges? What are likely to be triggers for them? And I think that part is fundamentally missing. But I think it kind of needs to work both ways. I think traditional mainstream education is particularly lacking in the UK. Special schools are a lot better equipped to kind of deal with that, but it is definitely a challenge in that way.
And for you, Anna, what more can be done to help autistic people, both in education and in the working world, leading through into the working world?
What I would say is I'd like to see more working together. So education, social care and health, they're always talking about networking, working together, but I don't really see that much evidence of it. I'd also like to see autistic adults and parents working more together. We should be pulling together, because it's a difficult world that we live in at the moment, and there's a lot of negativity out there. So for me, we should be working together. There is that, I would call that, virtual autism community out there, and we should be looking after each other, because life is hard enough as it is. And we should have a voice for adults like my son Angelo, that has quite significant sensory processing difficulties and working on his independent living skills all the time, because as I've said before, the question at the back of every parent's mind is, who's going to look after my son when I'm no longer around? And we need to have better social care for our children and our adults. I speak to adults that are worried about their mum and dad dying. I've spoken to a 2 gentlemen just recently where both their parents have died. One gentleman I've been helping who was living on the streets for 3 months in a tent outside when it was really cold with his dog. And what I did was I crowdfunded a hit for him. So I got him into a hotel and now he's got his own place. But it took a little bit of time of me knocking on the doors and saying, hey, why is he sleeping in the tent outside? This gentleman needs support. He's got quite significant sensory. He's got a dog. But it was like getting them to listen to each other, like the crisis, listening to social care, listening to whoever the other, I can't really sort of share the information about this gentleman, but you get the gist of what I'm talking about. It's about people. Our kids and our adults are not second-class citizens. They deserve the same support as everybody else. And I know it's tough, but what I've discovered is the people that shout the loudest are the ones that get what they want in the end. And it shouldn't be like that. But hey, the way I look at it is I say to parents, you want the best for your son. Don't worry about what anyone else thinks. Just navigate that system the best you can. And if you need support, get it and just get to that end goal. Because if you don't do it, no one else is going to do it for you. So more working together. That's what I want to see. More autism acceptance. So come on, everyone. Let's get working together and keep going forward one day at a time.
Well, thank you so much for being with me today. It's been lovely listening to all your wisdom. Mark Blakey, Andrew Crosbie, Wendy Flewitt and Anna Kennedy. Thank you so much for listening. We really hope you enjoyed this episode of Autism in Conversation with Auticon. If you'd like to know more about the podcast, would be interested in applying for a job as an Auticon consultant, or would like further information about how Auticon can help support your business, please visit auticon.co.uk. This episode was recorded in September 2022. Recording and production was at Strathmore Studios in Clerkenwell, London. It was engineered and edited by Billy Godfrey and music was by The Lethargies. That's all from us this time. Thanks again for listening and bye for now.